Okay, so imagine you're right in the middle of some huge public crisis, maybe a widespread health scare or, a natural disaster that's just turned everything upside down.
Everything's chaotic.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And you desperately need clear, reliable information. What actually separates the communication that helps you figure things out
Mhm.
from the stuff that just, well, adds to the confusion? What makes it work when things are falling apart?
It's such a critical question, isn't it? Because in those moments, good communication isn't just about facts.
Right.
It's fundamentally about guiding people, reducing panic, reducing harm, and building or just holding on to that essential trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's precisely what we're digging into today. We're doing a deep dive into crisis communication, specifically what the experts seem to agree on as the best practices,
Foundational stuff.
foundational stuff for communicating during these big, widespread public crises.
And our source for this, it pulled together insights from, well, a whole range of leading crisis communication experts and their research. The goal was really to synthesize all that knowledge
Okay.
and identify some core standards, guidelines for effective communication, especially when it's public agencies managing these large-scale events.
So our mission here really is to pull out those key principles, that expert consensus, so you can understand the backbone of communicating effectively when the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, and hopefully it gives you a lens, to spot these practices when they're happening.
Or maybe notice when they're missing, right, out in the real world.
Exactly. So maybe we should start with, what do we even mean by best practices here? The source explains it's a term often used in, say, process improvement or benchmarking.
Right, looking at what works to get better.
Yeah, basically. Here, they function more like general standards or guidelines, maybe reference points.
So not like a super rigid checklist you have to follow step by step.
No, definitely not. They can come from just observing what's worked before, practice-driven, or they might be built from theories, like the grounded theory approach the source mentions, where you're looking for patterns in real-world data.
Okay.
But, and this is really crucial, the source cautions that just adopting them wholesale needs care.
Why is that?
Because crises are just so diverse, so dynamic. What works perfectly in one context, maybe a hurricane response, might need a lot of tweaking for, say, an industrial accident or a health outbreak. Think of them as guiding principles, not universal blueprints.
Which really brings us to the challenge, doesn't it? Why is it so hard to pin down best practices, specifically for crisis communication?
Well, there are a few big reasons. First, thankfully, major crises are pretty rare events,
Right.
which makes it hard to build up a huge, consistent body of data to study. Then there's just the massive variety in the types of crises. Natural disasters need different communication than, say, a deliberate attack or a tech failure.
And I guess the goals can conflict sometimes, too.
Oh, absolutely. An agency might be focused on reducing public harm, which is primary, but they also need to maintain order. Maybe an organization involved is worried about its reputation. Meanwhile, the public just wants accurate info, fast, to protect themselves. So yeah, these different pressures can really pull communication in competing directions.
Yeah, exactly.
And crises are just fundamentally dynamic, unpredictable. The source is really clear. Cookie-cutter approaches just don't work. Crisis plans are vital, yes, but they're best as flexible outlines, not detailed scripts you try to follow word for word. You just can't script chaos.
No, you really can't. The source also kind of touches on how the field itself has changed, right? Moving from this old split between risk communication
Yeah, like PSAs about smoking, focus on persuasion.
and crisis communication, which often
Yeah.
came out of PR, focusing on, image repair after something bad happened.
Right. And now those are kind of merging into what people often call CIRC, crisis and emergency risk communication.
Sir.
It's seen as more integrated, an ongoing process. It recognizes that risks and crises aren't totally separate things, but part of a continuum.
Got it. And we should probably clarify the scope here, right, for the best practices we're talking about today, based on this source.
Good point. Yeah, they're focused specifically on those widespread public crises or disasters that are primarily managed by public agencies.
So think like the CDC during an outbreak or FEMA responding to a huge storm.
Exactly. In those situations, the absolute top priority is accurate, timely information aimed squarely at helping people and reducing harm. Blame might get sorted out later, but it's secondary during the immediate response.
Right.
And the source does note, if you were talking about, say, a corporate reputation crisis, the list of best practices might look quite different.
Okay, that's a useful distinction. So Given all these challenges and this specific focus, how did the experts actually, land on these core practices?
The approach was synthesis, basically pulling together the foundational work from the big names in the field.
Key thinkers.
Yeah, people who've really shaped our understanding. And they drew not just from academic research, but heavily from real-world experience, case studies, even anecdotal observations from being involved in actual crisis responses.
So it wasn't just ivory tower stuff. It was
Yeah.
grounded in what actually happened.
Precisely. And the list they came up with initially, it wasn't just published like that. It went through this iterative review process.
Oh, okay.
An expert panel critiqued it, refined it, tweaked the points based on their collective knowledge.
And the source mentioned there was a pretty high degree of agreement among these experts on the core ideas, like planning is essential, coordination is essential.
Yeah, that consensus is powerful. It suggests these aren't just random ideas, but fundamental principles that hold up across different experiences and research streams.
Which brings us then to the main event. These 10 key principles that the expert consensus identified. And the source presents them not as a detailed how-to, but more as overarching foundations.
Right. Think of them as the essential pillars for effective crisis communication in that public agency context we discussed.
Okay, let's walk through them. And let's talk about why each one is highlighted. First up is process approaches and policy development. What's the core idea there?
Okay, this one's about making sure communication isn't just an add-on at the end.
An afterthought.
Exactly. It needs to be woven into the entire decision-making process around a crisis. That means from anticipating risks before anything happens, right through the active response phase, and even into the recovery and lessons learned part afterwards.
So not just telling people what was decided, but being part of deciding it.
Precisely. Because, as the source points out, that means the communication perspective thinking about public concerns, information needs, potential reactions gets brought into the planning room early. It helps avoid those situations where the communicators are just scrambling to catch up or where the communication feels like, just spin trying to justify decisions made in a vacuum. Integrating communication actually leads to better overall decisions.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Communication as a strategic partner right from the get-go. Okay, principle number 2, pre-event planning. This feels obvious, but what's the specific emphasis from the experts?
Well, it might seem obvious, but the source absolutely hammers home that planning before a crisis hits is non-negotiable. It's how you identify your vulnerabilities ahead of time,
Okay.
how you figure out initial response steps so you can make decisions faster when everything's chaotic, and how you identify what resources you'll actually need. They mention things like risk analysis systems, kind of like HACCP and food safety.
Oh, yeah. Hazard analysis, critical control points.
Right. That same idea of identifying critical points where things could go wrong and planning for them.
So really mapping out potential failure points and having a plan A, B, C.
Exactly. And crucially, the source stresses planning isn't a one-off task where you write a big document and stick it on a shelf.
Right. It has to be a living thing.
It's an ongoing process. It needs regular updates. And really importantly, it needs involvement from a wide range of stakeholders, including the community itself. Agencies like FEMA and the CDC actually offer templates to help structure this.
Oh, useful.
Yeah, covering things like who the spokesperson is, getting media lists ready, setting up coordination procedures in advance.
Okay, moving on. Principle number 3, partnerships with the public. This sounds like it goes beyond just broadcasting information.
Oh, definitely. This principle views the public not just as people you talk at, but as equal, legitimate partners in the whole response effort.
Partners, okay.
The source emphasizes, the public has a fundamental right to know about risks they face. And the organizations managing the crisis have a responsibility to provide that information timely and accurately.
And it also means listening to them.
Yes, actively seeking out and listening to their concerns. It's about a dialogic approach, two-way street. And a really key point the source makes here is challenging that old myth, that persistent fear that giving the public accurate, maybe even alarming information will cause mass panic.
Right, the don't tell them they'll freak out idea.
Exactly. Their analysis suggests the opposite is true. Withholding information is actually more likely to stop people from taking the right steps to protect themselves.
That's a really powerful counterpoint.
Yeah.
And it flows right into the 4th principle. Listen to the public's concerns and understand the audience.
It does. It builds directly on that partnership idea. You have to actively listen to what people are worried about, understand what information they need, and then, tailor your messages.
Adapt to what you're hearing.
Yeah. And the source highlights something critical. building those positive relationships and that goodwill before a crisis hits. That's where your credibility and trust come from during the event.
So you can't really build trust effectively in the middle of the fire. You need to have laid the groundwork.
That's it exactly. If you haven't built trust beforehand, it's incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to establish it when things are going sideways. The source uses the mad cow disease scare as an example.
Okay.
Public fear was way out of proportion to the actual statistical risk, but people acted based on that fear because, well, that was their reality.
Right. Perception is reality in that sense.
It shapes behavior. So monitoring public perception, understanding the audience's viewpoint is absolutely essential. Whether it's factually correct or not, you have to address it.
Okay, principle 5. Honesty, candor, and openness. These sound like basic ethics, but why are they singled out as a specific best practice?
And they are fundamental ethics, but they're listed because they are absolutely core to credibility and trust in a crisis. The source kind of breaks them down on a spectrum.
Okay.
Honesty is the baseline, don't lie. Candor goes further. Tell the whole truth as you know it, even the bad parts, maybe even the worst case scenarios. Openness is about accessibility and speed, being available, sharing info quickly.
And why is that so tough to stick to when things are chaotic?
Well, several reasons. Crises are full of uncertainty, right? You often don't have all the information. Then there's that myth of panic. Again, the fear that telling the full, messy truth will make things worse. And sometimes just, structural problems, communication breakdowns within the organization make immediate openness difficult. But the source argues really strongly that withholding info backfires.
How so?
Because if you don't share what you know, people will find information somewhere else. And often that somewhere else is inaccurate or speculative rumor.
And you lose control of the message.
Completely. Plus, let's be frank, responses that are less than fully honest often just look like you've got something to hide, even if you don't. It damages trust immensely.
So, really difficult, but totally essential.
Okay.
Number 6. Collaborate and coordinate with credible sources.
This one's all about building those bridges before you need them, setting up strategic alliances, networks with other agencies, relevant organizations, trusted community leaders well before any crisis hits.
So you know who to talk to, who to work with.
Exactly. So you can coordinate your messages and your actions when things kick off. It means identifying who the credible experts are, validating your sources in advance, building those relationships across different levels and groups.
And the main payoff for doing all that prep work?
Consistency. The source points out that one of the biggest sources of public confusion and mistrust during a crisis is getting conflicting messages from different authorities.
Oh yeah, that's incredibly frustrating.
Totally. They mention examples like communication snags after 9/11 or during the anthrax attacks, where lack of coordination led to contradictory advice. Good coordination isn't just nice to have, it's absolutely necessary for an effective overall response.
Makes perfect sense. All right, principle 7, meet the needs of the media and remain accessible.
Okay, so the media, like it or not, are usually your main pipeline to the public in a big crisis.
They get the word out.
They do. And the source frames this not as, oh God, the media, how do we manage them, but as seeing them as strategic resource you need to work with.
So engage them proactively.
Yes, honestly, openly, proactively. The source specifically advises against being evasive or putting out those overly rosy, reassuring statements that don't match the facts on the ground. That just kills credibility fast. And training your spokespeople thoroughly before a crisis is vital here. And you have to fight that urge, that institutional instinct sometimes to just circle the wagon.
Shut down, become inaccessible.
Yeah, resist that. Accessibility to the media is a core practice for getting accurate information out effectively.
Okay, number 8. Communicate with compassion, concern, and empathy. This feels important.
It really is. It speaks to the human side of it all. The analysis found that showing genuine compassion, concern, empathy, it significantly boosts the messenger's credibility.
People trust them more.
Yes, and it makes the message itself seem more legitimate to the public. People respond much more positively to spokespersons who actually acknowledge the fear, the harm, the suffering caused by the crisis, and show some empathy for those affected.
It makes the official voice feel less, official and more human.
Exactly. The source notes that sometimes officials worry that showing emotion seems unprofessional.
Right.
But the perception from the public can be that it just seems cold, uncaring, and that actively undermines the message and the trust. Showing genuine concern actually helps frame the whole response effort more positively.
That's a really important point about perception. Okay, number 9. Accept uncertainty and ambiguity.
Crises are messy. They are, by definition, high uncertainty events. So, the source strongly advises that acknowledging that uncertainty up front is a best practice.
So don't pretend you know everything.
Right. Don't feel like you have to project this absolute certainty or offer premature reassurances because the situation will likely change. And when it does, if you were overly certain before, your credibility takes a massive hit.
So it's okay to say, look, we don't have all the answers yet.
Yes. The source suggests using what they call strategic ambiguity, saying things like, the situation is fluid, or we're still gathering the facts. That gives you room to refine the message as you learn more without having to walk back definitive statements later.
But there's a caution there too, right?
A critical one. This shouldn't be an excuse to hide uncomfortable truths or to delay vital warnings. Waiting until you have perfect certainty often means you wait too long. Information needed to save lives or prevent harm has to get out, even if it's not 100% complete yet.
A difficult balancing act. And finally, number 10, messages of self-efficacy. What's that about?
This is about empowering the public. It means giving people specific, clear, actionable things they can do themselves.
To help themselves.
Yes, to reduce harm and maybe regain some small sense of control in what feels like a totally chaotic situation. These messages should recommend concrete harm-reducing actions.
Like what?
Depends on the crisis, right? Could be hygiene steps during an outbreak, how to secure your home before a hurricane, where to go for treatment, what channels to monitor for updates.
Giving people agency when they feel powerless.
Exactly. And the source includes things like helping neighbors in this too. Actions that benefit others can also give people a sense of purpose and control. Offering a range of possible actions is usually good practice. Okay.
And they make an interesting side point. Sometimes actions that don't have an obvious, immediate physical benefit, maybe like displaying a flag after 9/11, can still serve really important social or psychological functions.
Managing anxiety, building community feeling.
Right. And officials should be careful about dismissing those kinds of actions unless they're actually harmful. The key for all self-efficacy messages, though, is that the recommended actions must be clear, consistent, and seem useful, have real or apparent utility to the people getting the message.
Wow, okay. That is a really solid set of 10 principles, distilled from a lot of experience and research.
It is. And it's worth saying, again, like the source does, these aren't meant as rigid step-by-step rules. They're general standards. But they're also really interconnected. You can't really isolate them.
You can't just decide, oh, we'll be good at planning, but not so much honesty.
Exactly. Because failing badly at one, like, say, openness or candor, makes it incredibly hard to succeed with the others, like building those partnerships or coordinating effectively.
Yeah.
It really demands an integrated approach.
Right. And always remembering that while these principles give you the framework, every single crisis is unique. It's dynamic. You constantly need judgment and adaptation to apply them effectively.
So if we pull this all together, understanding these 10 principles really gives you a powerful lens, doesn't it?
I think so.
It lets you look at how organizations, how leaders communicate when things get chaotic, and see that effective communication isn't just about, polished press conferences. It's deeply rooted in solid preparation, genuine connection with the public, and those core values like honesty and empathy.
Yeah, it really underscores that crisis communication, at least in this public agency context, is fundamentally less about managing an image and much more about serving the public good through clear, credible, trustworthy interaction.
Which leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? Given that every crisis is unique, it's dynamic, it's unpredictable, and these 10 points are the underlying principles for navigating that. How can communicators best prepare? Not just for the kinds of emergencies they expect and plan for, but for the truly unprecedented, the genuinely unexpected things that might come along.
That's the ongoing challenge, isn't it? Something to definitely ponder the next time you see crisis communication playing out in the world. How well does it stack up against these foundational ideas?